idea that I was going to be talking to myself. Thanks for showing up. So today's the last lecture. We're going to finish a few slides on the motor learning PowerPoint, and then we will have a conversation about the information in chapter, I think it's 18. Is that the last chapter number? Yes, chapter 18. Okay? And that chapter relates to the final assignment, but I'm considering making that assignment a bonus. So I'd like to talk to you about that at the end. Okay. So let's have a look at the last bit of the motor learning that I wanted to discuss. Okay, so remember we were talking about the fact that we can't see learning, that we have to imply that learning is occurring, and we can do that by using a transfer test or a retention test, okay? And then I think that this idea is important to go over, this concept of the stages of learning. So by now, you should be well versed in the idea that we don't have massive changes in behavior from something that's relatively weak to something that's very strong overnight. It doesn't happen in motor skills, it doesn't happen in your academic work, it won't happen when you go to a job with a new learning curve. All right, we take little steps on our learning journey, and we have to persevere and we have to practice in order to get better at anything, okay? So an older model of this idea of these stages, as you can see, nearly as old as me, not quite, Fitz and Posner's model of learning. And although it's old, it's still very relevant today, depending upon which perspective you take for your research. You might still use the Fitz and Posner's model. It's based in an information processing type base, right? So that way back at the beginning of the semester when we were looking at different approaches, different perspectives, Fitz and Posner's model would fit under that information processing umbrella. And then the chapter also introduces Bernstein's model of learning, which would fit under the constraints ecological umbrella. Okay, so we'll have a look at this Fitz and Posner one in some detail here. So in Fitz and Posner's there are 3 stages of skill acquisition. Okay, so we start off as a cognitive learner, and then we move, if we practice enough, we're going to move into an associative learner. And then if we're really lucky and we get tons of practice and we get support from families and peers and everybody else, we might make it into the autonomous stage. And this model of learning applies to different skills, right? So I might become autonomous in basketball, but I'm only associative in tennis, right? So it's not a global concept, it's domain and activity specific. All right? So when we're watching people move through these learning stages, we're going to see very distinct performance and performer and performance characteristics that change as the skill becomes better and better learned. Okay? So we want to think of them as a continuum, particularly when we're transitioning from one stage to the next stage. The performance is going to be very variable, right? I might do one trial that looks like I'm moving up, and then the next couple of trials drop me back down again. So during that transition phase, we would expect to see a lot of variability. Okay? And we blend and overlap. So the cognitive is the beginner. They're focusing on cognitive type problems like, where is my hand? And I might have to look at my hand, right? The associative, I'm starting to be able to check out a few cues in the environment and take that information on board. And then in the autonomous stage, it is what it sounds like. In this stage, we would expect the skill to be automatic, right? And I'm not having to pay really any attention to the skill. I can give all my attention to the game, to the strategy, and things like that. Okay. So stage one of Bernstein's model is called freezing the degrees of freedom. So we mentioned this idea of degrees of freedom at the joints, and depending on how many movements you can do at a joint. So like my elbow can only do one thing. My knee can do two things. It can twist and it can bend. My shoulder has many, many degrees of freedom, right? When we watch a beginner, we often tell beginners to relax, right? You're too stiff. Try to relax, okay? And that stiffness is what Bernstein calls freezing the degrees of freedom, okay? The second stage is releasing those degrees of freedom. So as we get more experience and we practice more, I start to relax more and the movement starts to become more smooth, right? And then his third phase is what he calls exploiting those degrees of freedom. How do I use the mechanics of those degrees to create a movement pattern that is more effective? Okay. So they do quite a nice job in the chapter of sort of comparing these models. I'm going to stick with the Fitz and Posner model for now. All right, so our cognitive stage. Our learner, our beginner, is maybe not consciously, but their brain is trying to understand what this skill is about. What's the goal movement pattern for the skill? All right? And the brain starts to build what they call a cognitive map. So what's the plan? What's the strategy for this skill as a beginner? Right? So typically, we're going to see performances that aren't very good, huge variability from trial to trial, lots of very big errors that we can identify as the teacher, right? And that's important because we want to correct a big error first, right? What's the biggest error? That's the thing I'm going to correct first of all. And then I'll take the next biggest error, right? I can't correct the whole thing at one time, right? And this beginner is paying lots of attention to how they do the skill. right? It's primarily under visual control. So if you think of someone starting to learn to play the piano, right? They're going to be watching their fingers as they hit the key, all right? If I'm learning to throw a ball, I might look at my hand or look at my feet in order to move my feet, right? So a lot of visual information necessary and a lot of deliberate attention to how do I do the skill. So if I'm the teacher and I recognize that this person is in the cognitive stage of learning a skill, then there are some strategies I can use to help that individual and not overwhelm them. All right? So you want to introduce the skill relatively briefly. Don't give them too much detail about what the skill is going to become, because that's more than they can manage. All right? We need lots of modeling. So we need demonstration, we need a visual demonstration and verbal explanation. So that means if you can't do the skill very well, you might have to use someone else from the class, or you might have to find a video model for the learner, right? Step 3, give them plenty of time to practice the skill, right? Don't tell them that they've just got a couple of attempts and then they have to move to the next station. Give them lots of time to practice. And then you need to give appropriate level of feedback, right, aimed at correcting initially the biggest error, right, and then work down, okay? So this cognitive stage is quite interesting to watch, because if you have someone, remember those motor abilities that we spoke about last week, if you have an individual who's a beginner, but they have a good collection of motor abilities that fit the skill you're trying to teach them, this cognitive stage can be over very quickly, right? It may take someone else weeks of practice to get through the cognitive stage and start to become more associative, right? So that means you have to have some flexibility in your lesson plans, right? Or your training plans. You can't expect everybody to progress at the same rate, which means you've got to have some things up your sleeve to keep the people who are progressing quickly engaged, and keep the people who are progressing more slowly still motivated to practice, okay? That's your job, right? Then we have the associative stage, and this is the point of time where this skill is getting grooved, right? Lots and lots of practice. We start to fix some smaller errors, so we're refining the motor pattern, all right? And when we're teaching in this group, we've got to make sure that we're planning lots of developmentally appropriate practices, right, that are going to be effective at helping these learners engage and move forward with their motor program, right? So here, the cognitive map that was very kind of woozy in the cognitive stage is starting to become more developed. It's starting to be a little more reliable, right? So the variability as they move through the associative stage, the variability drops down, and you start to see repetition of a motor program that can be repeated over and over, right? So here we're reducing the amount of cognitive activity. I don't have to, as I move through associative, I'm not having to think quite as much about the moving of the skill, the execution of the skill. So attention to the execution starts to drop and they start to think about what else is going on. We're eliminating these big errors and starting to refine smaller errors. The learner, as they go through the associative stage, if you're doing a good job as the teacher, the learner should start to be able to detect and correct their own errors. So when you're working with this group, you often have to start to, instead of jumping in with the correction, you have to pull back and start to ask them, what did you do wrong? So what are you going to change on the next trial? Right? We're going to see improvements in many aspects of the motor skills. So if it involves speed, it's going to get faster. If it has to be consistent, it will become more consistent. Right? If it's a closed skill in a very stable environment, we need it to become more consistent. If it's an open skill that has to be performed in a very variable environment, then we want it to be flexible, right? We need it to be able to change at the last minute if the environment changes. So in general, we're seeing big improvements in performance, but we wouldn't say this person was truly proficient or expert yet. Right? So there's still more work going on as they move through the associative stage. So our final stage takes tons of practice and experience, right? It doesn't just happen quickly. I mean, we're talking years of work, years of practice. Right. And when the learner is moving into this stage and working in this stage, then their understanding of the skill is very good. They understand mechanics, they understand the errors that can occur, right? So their cognitive map is very developed at this point, highly developed, and the sequence of movements is becoming more automatic. So that means that there's very little conscious attention to the actual physical execution of the skill. So this is, when we say, oh, that skill is really grooved now, right? They're not thinking about it, they can just do it, and now I can get them to start paying attention to some other things, right? Depending on the type of skill that it is. They don't have to concentrate on technique. Closed skills are becoming very consistent. Open skills are highly diversified and flexible, and they're really good at detecting and correcting their own errors, right? So you have a different job now, right? So they can devote attention to other stimuli that are around, and as the teacher, your instruction, your role as the teacher with this group is very different, because your role is really based around maintaining the skill level for the person, and really keeping that person motivated, right? So that they still want to come to practice, they still want to improve, they still want. This has taken years and years. They've been doing this skill every day for years and years and years. And the thought of going to practice and doing it again is like, this is so boring. So how are you as the teacher, as the coach, as the trainer, how are you going to keep them motivated to keep coming back? Because we know if we don't continue to practice, the skill level is going to drop off. It might not ever go away, right? So like we talked about riding the bike. If I learn to ride the bike really, really well, it doesn't matter how long a break I take, I can always get on a bike and ride a bike, But some of these very complex sports skills need continual practice, right, to keep the neural pathways strong and to keep the motor pattern tweaked so that it doesn't dissolve. And then we get to the idea of expertise. So I get to the autonomous stage. That still doesn't mean that I'm a true expert. It means I'm very proficient at the skill now, but I'm not a true expert yet. Okay? So the research says that expertise takes a minimum of 10 years or 10,000 hours of intense, deliberate practice. So this is not the person that goes out and plays golf on Sunday morning or every other Sunday morning, right? This is deliberate, every day, in an organized environment practice, okay? And we often then, as the teacher, have to make sure that we're individualizing training activities so they're appropriate for what we're trying to achieve with that person, not the group, right? Expertise is domain specific. So this idea goes back to the conversation we had last week about the all-around athlete, right? If I'm going to be truly expert in something, it takes all my time, all my attention, all my thought to become an expert in that one thing. I don't have time to become an expert in something else as well, right? So we don't see a lot of transfer of capabilities from one field of expertise to another field that someone has no experience in, right? So we have a couple of different versions of transfer between skill. So we can have positive transfer, right? If the transfer is positive, that means that our previous experiences in movement facilitate the performance and learning of a new skill, right? So whether it's in a new context or whether I'm transferring a skill to a different context or I'm learning a completely new skill. That would be positive transfer if my previous experience made that easier, right? So that's something that an athletic trainer or someone working in rehab, in physical therapy, that's what they're aiming for, right? They don't want that previous experience to be a negative impact on the relearning of a skill, right? We can have negative transfer that can occur, and it's something as a PE teacher we have to be a little bit careful with, right? So in negative transfer, our previous experience interferes with learning a new skill or transferring a skill, right? So for example, if we're doing racket sports as a unit in our PE class, forehands in different games with different rackets and different balls or equipment to hit feel different and the motor pattern is different. So you might want to teach a tennis forehand before you teach a badminton forehand, for example, right? So you have to dig into the literature and see, okay, which skill, if I'm going to do forehands, I've got lots of options. I've got tennis, I've got badminton, I've got racquetball, I've got pickleball, right? Does it matter that we concentrate on them in an order, or can I just muddle them all together? The research would say you can't muddle them, right? There are positive transfers between racket sports, right? Because the individual understands, although the flight of the object is different, they understand the idea of the flight of the object. They understand that they've got to move early to get to the object to hit the forehand. So there's positive transfer there. But there's negative transfer in the execution of the actual motor pattern. Okay? And then some people include a third transfer group, which is zero transfer, which I always think is a little bit daft. Previous experience has no influence whatsoever on learning the new skill. So my swimming experience doesn't impact my learning to drive a car. Of course. So, depends which resource you're looking at. Right? So, here you need to optimal instruction, probably not very much instruction with someone who's an expert. You need to create a practice environment that's work-like and intense but personalized, right, and has some fun so that they stay motivated, okay? And that is all the motor learning info I have for you. Questions? No questions? Okay. So our last chapter. Our very last chapter. Yay! And let's see, what have I got here? That's the lab activity. Okay, these are just sheets. Oh, no, there we go. All right, and there is an article up on Blackboard for you that is kind of a summary. It's actually written, one of the authors on the article is one of the authors in the book. And here they're looking at combining theory and practice in the gymnasium. It's a practitioner article, it was in a PE journal, so it's very easy to read. Okay? So, if you have finished reading chapter 18, make sure that you take a look at this article as well. Okay? Okay, so chapter 18 is really just trying to pull the whole thing together for us. All right? They remind us that not everybody wants to be an elite athlete. And that movement occurs within many different contexts in everyday life. So we're not, the idea of motor development, the idea of stages of development isn't just isolated to a competitive athlete. It involves everybody on the planet, right? So, because they base the book on the constraints theory, they remind us of the interacting constraints, right? So at certain times, individual constraints have more influence than at other times. So we know that, because we looked at it, that when we go into puberty, that the change in the skeleton has a massive impact on the movement that I'm going to observe from the outside, right? And we also know that these changes and these interactions alter across the lifespan, that we don't just get to our mid-20s and we maintain those movement patterns for the rest of our life. That's not what happens, okay? So it's important that we treat each individual separately, right? If I'm working with a person, I can't assume something about their experience or their abilities, right? I have to treat them as an individual. I need to use that information and that idea to design developmentally appropriate tasks for that person, right? Because as the teacher, my goal is to enhance learning, right? That's what teaching, coaching, training is all about. Can I enhance this person's learning in this particular context, right? So I get to manipulate the environment and the task, right? It's difficult to manipulate the individual. And if I can manipulate those constraints, then that can be useful in influencing the motor pattern that emerges, right? So I can explain that to someone if they're old enough and they're cognitive enough to understand. Or, like when I'm working with the children on the playground, I manipulate constraints to tweak, to get a movement pattern that's more what I want, and they don't even know I'm doing it. They just think they're playing, right? So we have a couple of options then as the teacher, right? And we need to think about how do I use this information to make me a better teacher. That's the whole point, okay? So the first thing I can do is structure the environment, right? And so how much flexibility do I have within my environment, okay? I might be able to change the wall color. Remember that when we talked about catching, we said that the wall color was important, right? So can I change the wall color? Am I allowed to paint the wall in my gym? If I'm not allowed to paint it, can I put up big sheets of paper on the wall or something like that? What kind of surface are we going to work on? Are we going to work inside on the gym? Are we going to go out on the grass? Are we going to go on the concrete, right? I get to choose, I'm the teacher. So I need to think through what kind of surface would be most useful in this situation, right? The weather, well, I don't get to control the weather, right? So that means then that I have to be flexible. I've got to have plan A, plan B, and plan C for every lesson plan. Because if the only plan I have is we're going outside to do this skill today and we can't go outside, then what happens? We don't cancel PE, right? So what's the option? Okay. So that's my first thought, structuring my environment. Then my second thinking, kind of planning idea is designing the task that I want them to do. So I've got things I can manipulate. So I've got the goals of the task. I've got the rules of the task. I've got the equipment that we use for the task, right? I get to manipulate all of those, okay? So think about, do I want them to throw hard? Do I want them to throw accurately, right? What is it I'm asking them to do? Because we know that if I ask them to throw hard, we see something different than if I ask them to throw accurately. So I have to be very precise in my setup of the task, right? I've got to use developmentally appropriate equipment, so that ties back to the concept of body scaling that we talked about, right? If I give the 5-year-old a full-size racket and ask them to hit a tennis ball, I'm probably not going to see what I want, and they're not going to have much success, and they're not going to enjoy it very much. Okay? There's a very good example in the chapter of a game that whoever created the game called Clean the House, right? And so what they did was they put balls and bean bags on each side of a net. They put the net up high, like a volleyball net. And clean house means you have to pick up objects on your side of the net and throw them over the net, and the team that gets an empty clean house wins. It's probably never happened, right? So what's the point of that task? Okay. So at a certain point in teaching throwing, you want to look at what is happening with their elbow, right? So in order to throw over the top of the big net, the tall net, I have to lift my elbow up and release the ball beanbag quite early, right? So that task was specifically designed to get children who don't throw very well to lift their elbow and throw the ball up. Very, very tricky. I mean tricky as in sneaky. A sneaky little game. What a great idea, right? And the children playing the game probably don't have any reason to realize that this was an attempt to go from here to here, right? So you have to get creative, right? Now, in this chapter, they introduce another assessment tool, okay? And they call it a task analysis, and you'll see that there are several examples in the chapter of how to organize and use the task analysis. Okay? When you get to page 366, I do not want you to worry about the new model of constraints that they introduce. I want you to stick with the idea of our triangle. They introduce a hexagonal model, but I don't want to go there. I want to stick with our triangle, okay? So the task analysis, historically, right, a traditional kind of breakdown of the skill would be comparing what I'm watching to a correct, perfect model that I have in my head, right? And then my feedback is based on the error between what I'm watching and what my picture is, okay? So they've introduced this constraints-based task analysis to try to get us to think about these interacting constraints, right? And it gives us a much more developmentally appropriate challenge to progress the skill with, right? So, I can't read my notes because we've got the light turned off. Okay, so they have a kind of checklist of how to create this task analysis. All right, so let me see if I can do this on the whiteboard. Oh, I forgot to start recording. Aha! It's the last day and I forgot to press record. Oh no. What a goof up. Okay, good job with videoing it. Alright, so we want our text boxes. Okay, so step one is to pick the skill that we want, right? Step 2 is to decide what the individual constraints are that are important to be successful at the skill. So not all the individual constraints, but 3 or 4 constraints that if I'm going to be successful at this particular skill, I need to be able to do, right? So step 2 is to decide on the individual constraints. Oops, which is not spelled like that. Okay. Step 3 is then to pick several task and environmental constraints that that could be manipulated for this skill in regards to the individual constraints that I identified. Right? So here we're going to pick task and environmental constraints to manipulate. Okay. Step 4 is to create a continuum for each task and environmental constraint from easy to hard. Okay. So if you look at page 365, they give us some examples of how to use this. Right? Pick a task, determine the individual constraints, pick environmental and task constraints to manipulate, create a practical range from easy to hard, remembering that sometimes it only takes a very small change in the constraint to see quite a big change in the movement that emerges, right? So in the chapter, they give us an example for throwing and an example for striking. And then I've got an example here for kicking. Right. So, let's say our task is kicking. Okay. What would be some individual constraints I would need to be successful at kicking? What do you think? Anybody?
Can you repeat it?
What might be some individual constraints that would help me be successful at kicking? So think about the task of kicking. What do I have to be able to do?
Single leg ability.
Okay, so I have to be able to stand on one leg, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that means that I need balance. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, in order to balance on one leg, what do I need in that leg?
Strength.
Strength, good. Excellent. Now, as the skill becomes more complicated, if I am running and then I have to swing my leg and time it to hit a ball that is also moving, what would that involve?
Coordination.
Coordination, perfect. Yes, not a trick question. Excellent. Coordination. Okay, so we have 3 individual constraints. We could do more, but let's stop there. All right? So then we need to think about things we could manipulate that would help the student develop balance, strength, and coordination. Okay? So, for example, a task constraint could be movement of the ball. Right? And movement of the ball would work on balance and coordination. Okay? I need something that would work on strength. So, to kick the ball a long way would take more strength than to kick the ball just a little way. Right? So I could use the distance that I have to kick the ball, perhaps. Right? Or I could use, I don't know what they call it in soccer, but that task they do where they like keep bouncing the ball on their foot while they stand on one leg. Right? So that's a couple of task constraints. What about an environmental constraint that would impact kicking? So I think surface would be important. Right? Is it easier to kick a ball on a gym floor, or is it easier to kick a ball out on the grass?
Gym floor.
Probably on the gym floor, as long as the children have good shoes on. Right? I don't know enough about the skill of kicking, but that would be my guess. You may be, someone might want to argue that actually kicking on the grass is easier because the ball doesn't move as far. Right? You're the teacher, you get to decide. And here's the thing, right? You create this matrix, this template for kicking, and you try it out in your gym, and you realize that actually the children who were struggling found it easier to kick outside on the concrete or outside on the grass than they did in the gym. So you have to tweak your lesson plan, right? Who knows? That's what teaching's all about. We get to tweak things all the time, right? So then I've got my constraints, okay? And you could put them in like a little table, right? And my constraints are at the top. Now I have to create my continuum. So if my constraint is movement of the ball, what's the easiest, the most simple thing I can do as the teacher? What would you do with a 3-year-old?
Probably play around with them.
creating a continuum for movement of the ball, what would be your first step?
Change the ball size.
That's a different constraint. It's a good constraint, but it's a different constraint, right? Our constraint is movement of the ball. What's the most simple version? No movement of the ball, right? The ball's stationary. So that would be my simple version, right? Then I've got to think, what's my difficult, what's my hard version? So that could be the ball is moving very fast, or it could be the direction, or it could be a combination of how fast the ball is moving and the direction the ball is coming from, right? That would be my very difficult choice. And then I get to create the continuum from stationary to very fast coming from, I don't know, a diagonal kick. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah? So let's see what time have we got. I've got a bit of time here. Let me. Okay. And our first one is movement of ball. So here we're going to have stationary. Here we're going to say moving fast. Right? So then what I've got to do is, okay, what's my continuum from stationary to moving fast? Right? With everything we've done all semester, we know as the teacher, going from stationary to then giving them a moving fast ball is not going to produce success. Right? And the goal is to produce success and change in the movement patterns so that people are enjoying moving. Right? So I might have to come up with a couple of other options from point A to point B, so I've got some flexibility here. Does that make sense? Then our next one was distance. So it would be easier to kick to something that was nearby, right, or close. And it's going to be harder and work my strength more if I have to kick to something far away. How am I going to manipulate that from close to far away? Sorry. Okay. So, then our last one that we came up with was the surface. And we decided that the gym floor would probably be the easiest. I'm inclined to, I think as long as they got good shoes on, the gym floor is probably the easiest because the ball will move the most and they'll get the most satisfaction from it, maybe. Right? On the other hand, the ball's going to move faster and that might make it more tricky. So I don't know, you'd have to play around with it and see. And maybe what's going to be the hardest? Maybe like sand? And then we would say concrete, grass, right? And you might not agree with me, right? It's not a right or a wrong. Someone who knows the skill of kicking very well might say, this is silly, you got it completely back to front here, right? So I've got my table now. Right, so this is where it gets interesting because now I have a couple of different options on how to use this table. Right? I can use it as an assessment tool. Right? Where are my notes? Oh, there they are. Right? I can use it as an assessment tool to standardize assessment across all my classes. And I can also use it to structure lesson plans, right? Do I scale up or down in challenge for the next class? So let's say we're going to teach kicking for the first time to a group of elementary children who are in the first grade, and I don't know anything about these kids. I don't know how much experience they have at kicking. I don't know if they went to a preschool or a kindergarten that had a PE teacher. So I'm going to set up my lesson the first day. I'm going to set, the first day I'm going to set up stationary, close, in the gym. And that's going to be the basis of my lesson plan for kicking for day one. Right? Then I realized that some of the children, standing still and kicking was a bit too easy. So on day 2, I set up another station where I also include whatever I decided my next level was going to be. But I keep the distance close and I keep us on the gym floor. Right? And then maybe on the next day, I do these two, but I pick this level, but we stay in the gym. Does that make sense? So it's quite a lot of work to create the table, right, as the teacher. And once you've created it, you're going to have to keep tweaking it anyway. Right? That's just how it goes. So I put in the work in creating the table, but once I've got the table, making my lesson plans becomes much simpler because now I can play around with the levels of challenge. I can play around with which constraints do I want to manipulate on this day. Right? And I've got multiple options available to me once I've created a good table. And then when I use the table, I might go, didn't even think that I could play around with that constraint. Let's add another column on. Make sense? If I,
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, if I wanted to use it as an assessment tool, right? So, Jane's assessment. Stationary was too easy. But her eye-foot coordination was not great. So she scores here for movement of the ball. But she's pretty strong, so she can kick from quite a long way. And we ran it outside on the concrete, and she handled the concrete very well. So that would be her pre-assessment for kicking. Right? Then what we want is to run our kicking unit, right? So however long we're going to do that, let's say we do it for 3 weeks. And one of the things we do during the 3 weeks of PE is we work on kicking. Then we have to see, did she get any better, right? Well, she did, because she managed the ball moving in a different way, right? She got a bit stronger. Oops. And she was able to kick that distance out on the grass field. And this is our post-assessment. Right? So this can be very, very useful information for you as the teacher, because it means that for this one person in your class, A, the things you've done in your class worked, right? So that's nice to know, because she got better, right? But it also gives you a picture of what you can do to help her become even more competent, right? When she comes back to school in the 2nd grade. Okay? So, who do we have here to talk to? Colson, Glory, Isabel, Jackson, Kevin. All right, guys. You're the ones that came to class, so you get to help me out with this decision. All right? So if you look at the syllabus, there is one more assignment due based on this task analysis. Okay? And I was considering cancelling that assignment so that we can get on with working for the exam. And then I thought, well, maybe instead of cancelling it, maybe I should make it a bonus. And then people have the option to do it or not do it, based on their timetable. Right? Because there's quite a lot of stuff to study for this next exam. What are your thoughts on that? Give me some ideas.
I like the vote.
Sorry, say that again.
The bonus, yeah.
The bonus idea?
I like the bonus too.
The bonus idea? So does everybody like that?
How many points is it worth?
I'd have to look at it. I think it was originally worth 10%. I'm not sure that I would offer it as a bonus for 10%. I don't know. I need to go back and look at the grading and see. I might, but that seems a big bonus. So yeah, I'd have to think about that. It certainly wouldn't be more than 10%. Let's put it that way. So, does everybody feel that's the good way to go?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, then I will. What time is it? I have a phone call meeting at 11 o'clock. So I will, this afternoon, send out a notice about that and give you all the information. Thank you. Okay, anything else I can help with before we say goodbye? Don't forget, on Thursday will be our review session. Okay, so make sure that you've done some looking at things. Don't come into a review not having looked over your notes, right? That's not the best way to use that time. Okay. And then if there's anything that you need me to repeat, go over, we can do that then. I'll have some little questions and activity things like normal that we can do to try to get you focused on certain concepts. And we'll be good to go for next week. Okay? All right. Have a lovely day. If you're in Portalis, it's going to be chilly again today, but lovely and warm tomorrow. So